In today's episode of the Paytech Show, we're going to be learning about the huge changes happening in the payments industry. Retail payments specifically have changed forever. Customer demand for enhanced, invisible, and instant payments means that retail banks can no longer have their cake and eat it too when it comes to low value, high volume payments that their retail wings were used to. To find out more, I brought in some payment specialists from around the world to discover how this new ecosystem can be both beneficial to the bank, the retailer, and to you, the customer. Dialing in from Finland, we have our resident payment specialist, Jukka from Giesecke and Devrient, to find out how tokenization is enabling this increased demand for exciting new payment tech. Continuing our Nordic theme, we have Kirkegaard Folling from Nets, one of the leading payment providers in Europe. Last but not least, we have Nick Fisher from JCB, who can give us the exciting payment information coming out of Asia. So today we are going to be discussing fraud and payments, typically a huge topic after any big festival event, but even more so this year. Before we discuss some of the fraud issues that we might see this year, typically speaking, what are the biggest issues that banks have to deal with on the retail side?
Yeah, despite the fact that fraud patterns vary a great deal between or across regions, I believe that we could condense the challenge of fraud for European banks at least into three themes prior to the pandemic. And first of all, the nature of fraud has always been an arms race. So fraudsters are constantly developing their ways to be more and more sophisticated in tricking consumers and circumventing the technology. Merchant and issuers are constantly doing the opposite to counter those threats. So whatever technology has been implemented until now, fraudsters has eventually find a way to either work around it or just target another weakness point. So I think that's important to recognize. Secondly, fraud has grown into quite a substantial illegal industry. And as the conversion of e-com is happening, fraudsters move their attention to e-com, of course. And already going into 2020, the amount of fraud accounted for e-com was above 70% in the Nordics at least. So prior to the pandemic, it was quite a significant issue. Fraud on e-com is mainly driven by pinching and smishing campaigns, where victims are lured into exposing information about their credit cards or their bank account details, and then those were misused on the internet. Quite a lot of card details and bank account details have been you have been able to find that on the dark web. So the industry of fraud has turned into substantial, and fraudsters are also using prepackaged solution for doing fraud, which we call the fraud as a service. Maybe the third thing that was significant for issuers is the fact that convenience equals conversion. So the attention to friction-free payments for the consumer and the attention to merchants needing to accelerate their conversion rate has been a substantial element of also payment, but also fraud prevention in the past years. Payments needs to support both web shops in growing, but it also needs to support a hassle-free consumer experience. And finally, of course, it needs to be safe. So consequently, the traditional either friction-free or secure solutions or strategies have been ill-suited for the new reality for some times. Good examples of that are neobanks, who are catering for both convenience and for safety, which are growing their customer bases by threefold per year at the moment.
Got to talk a little bit around big holidays. I'm not just talking about Singles Day, red letter envelopes, Thanksgiving, Christmas, but all of them together, because there's a bit of an uptake in terms of e-commerce. Before we look into the fraud issues that we might see during these types of holidays, what are typically the biggest fraud issues that banks have to deal with on the retail side?
There are different, of course, multiple ways to group the fraud. So I guess that there are as many definitions as there are so-called experts in this space. But One rather simple is to probably categorize them to that there is a card-related payments. Then there are fraud which is related more to the identity theft. And then there are things or fraud relating to telemarketing type of fraud. If you look the card fraud, which I think is the very much which is concerning us all, here more in detail. So there is a fraud which is related, of course, when you lose your card or it's getting stolen. Of course, then people can easily use that one to certain, let's say, payment transactions, whether it's a point of sales or on the online account takeover. And usually then there is a social engineering being used or phishing type of attacks, which are very common. And then there is, of course, I can't call them technologies, but the ways to actually copy your card skimming, which is very much related to MaxStripe cards, where you basically copy your MaxStripe data. And now there are also some attempts for so-called, I guess, shimming, which is then that you actually try to copy whatever you have on the chip card. So I think that these are the typical fraud cases that the banks and we as a consumer will confront.
A lot of the older generation, they do tend to, as time goes by, accumulate a lot more financial information in terms of payment cards, bank accounts, etc. Can we provide people with an easy way to self-check where all their payment credentials are? I mean, how safe you are?
Well, I think there are functionalities or services like what I was referring to, this token cockpit from us. So that's really convenient, consumer-friendly way to do this, so that you can visually see what merchants, for example, you have saved your card, and it's really visualized, not just that there is a name of let's say merchant A or B, but there is also the logos and everything available, because that's the way how we nowadays understand our world is through different kind of visual elements. There is a high security enabled and for example on this one, and tools given to both customers but also to the banks to better prevent the fraud. Now I would still say that there is consumers should always be very alert on even if you have a tools like token cockpit or similar, when they do make payment. It's the same analogy, almost like with the cash. So we will really kind of look, of course, very closely and want to be sure that where our leather wallet is. So I would never put it on my back pocket. Somebody do, but that's already almost like an invite for somebody to steal it. And the same happens here in the digital world. So if you are careless, so for sure then there will be somebody who will make use out of that one. So I would say as a conclusion, it's a combination of that there are technologies and services enabling all us to protect ourselves, but you should really look also from the how you behave, and again, this communication and education is extremely important part of the preventing fraud.
Are there any new technologies that you're particularly excited about in the world of e-commerce?
Tokenization is critical to that process, I see. I also see there's a growth of contactless payments being done online. I see that as an interesting solution. What it essentially does is give the user the opportunity to do a contactless transaction on their mobile phone, and that links the phone to the shopping cart when they're doing an e-com transaction. This makes it more comforting for the consumer, but also gives a lower risk to the merchant and potentially bypasses some of the challenges of processing an e-com payment. The other area I see as a strong growth on the technology side is the EMV 3DS 2.2. So that improves the stronger customer authentication user experience by enabling biometric authentication. And also from the JCB point of view as well, it increases the ability of merchants and acquirers to take advantage of the TRA exemptions, but also allows them to apply it to more complex user case sectors such as travel.
We're seeing a fair shift in terms of the demographics and behaviours in e-commerce. Now that older generations are sometimes not as tech savvy, for example, as Shopee Online, is this going to create the perfect storm of e-commerce fraud this year?
No doubt that the pandemic has sort of accelerated the digital in general. And opposite prior years, last year, the single biggest change was not the speed in advancement in technology, but the biggest change was the leap that consumers made to engage with the technology that we already provided. And as a consequence, we see a mass adoption to e-commerce across sort of non-traditional tech-savvy segments like the elderly people or some people who preferred not to buy online early on. A recent study showed that the dollar amount of fraud in April last year increased by 35% in the US. In Europe, we haven't seen the same development in total fraud, but we observe a significant shift, of course, to e-com as the transaction volume also tilts towards e-com. And a consequence is that the threat landscape is changing as we speak, and fraudsters are targeting vulnerable, non-techie consumers who are engaging with technology or doing regular purchases online for the first time. However, I think a good example to counter is strong customer authentication, which was recently implemented in Europe. And that's a good example of yet another effective measure that has been installed to counter the damages of such a storm. So to some degree, yes, it is a perfect storm, but I think at least in Europe, we are quite ready for it.
Since the risk lies with the bank, what can these institutions do to educate their customers when it comes to online fraud?
I think it's really the two things. Of course, the communication, so that they really need to constantly communicate, and really then constantly means that there is a repeated world is not ready. We are it's too easy to kind of forget, and especially when you are in the heat of the moment of doing your payment. So then you just want to make that transaction kind of completed, and you might actually ignore certain things which you shouldn't, even if you're an educated customer, not to mention then if you go for people who are not that savvy. And this is of course applicable to the banks, so they need to do, the issuing banks, because they kind of cover the liability. But also, I think every country, the authorities, they have the same message, and the merchants do. Many banks, of course, do this now, also by having warnings and guidance, for example, in their apps and wallets, and of course on their websites. And also some merchants do the same. This is maybe a bit kind of then questionable, because if you are on a merchant site, can you even know that it's a genuine merchant site? But yes, I think that this is the way you need to do it, and provide this information in a easy to access way. Like I said, for example, in your mobile app or mobile banking app, like many of the banks do.
Well, that's all we've got time for on today's episode of the Paytech Show. I'd like to thank all of our guests for their time, and for you, the viewer, too. You can catch the rest of the Paytech Show over at fintechf.com, and of course on YouTube and LinkedIn. See you all soon.